Welcome back. United Musicians and Allied Workers formed in 2020 to address the issues many artists face in the music industry. Streaming royalties, record contracts, and artist payments are just a few of the several injustices facing these musicians. UMAW aims to organize music workers who fight for a more just music industry. Organizer and musician Joey La Neve DeFrancesco joined me to discuss this effort. Joey, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, as I mentioned, you are a musician as well, so can you talk a little bit about your background as a musician?
Yeah, I've been a working, touring, recording musician for about 15 years, mostly with a band called Downtown Boys. It's like a punk band. We've done most of the things you'd think of as a band that can make some money. We've toured all over the place, put out records on good labels, but like most working musicians, still have never been able to make ends meet with music.
Now, I'm glad that you mentioned that because we're going to jump right into it. What are some of the challenges facing many musicians and artists, especially the way that we consume music now?
Yeah, so music's always been a hard industry to make a living in. I think everyone knows that. Hard to make it to a level where you can live off of it or have sustained success. That's always been true. But in the digital music landscape in our current economy, it's gotten just increasingly harder every single year. So it's like every other industry we're seeing where it's the top 1% of the 1% that's taking all of the money. So in this case, the tech CEOs, the heads of these major record label, while the workers, the musicians themselves, are not seeing anything, and that inequality is getting worse and worse every year. The industry is making money, right? I think some people think maybe the music industry is simply failing. That's why it's hard for musicians right now. But it's not true, right? The music industry is posting higher profits every single year now, but all of that money is simply going to the top. And a big part of it is the digital music landscape, like you were getting at here. Services like Spotify, like Apple Music, they are squeezing the musicians who are actually making the music from every possible angle, like paying us less and less money, diverting all of that profit in the industry to the very top. So at this point, for working class, middle class artists, it's virtually impossible to really make a sustainable living in this industry.
Now, you talked about streaming. For those who aren't in the music industry, how do streams and royalties work, and what do artists actually gain from that?
Right. So the industry has made this very convoluted, very kind of difficult for most musicians to grasp how exactly we're getting paid through streaming services. Royalty structures, so royalties, riders, how musicians get paid from our music getting played in the United States are very backwards, period. So we're amongst the only countries in the world where musicians, performers, have never gotten royalties from radio play. So when you hear a song on the radio, you might have thought in the past, oh, those artists playing that music are getting money from it. The songwriters are in some ways, but the musicians actually playing that music are not getting royalties from that. Virtually every other country in the world, the musicians do get paid, but in the US, this has always been this backwards thing. And that backwardsness has continued into now the streaming era. Where the law has simply not caught up with how these companies operate, with how the internet operates. So when fans are on Spotify listening to their favorite artists, those artists are getting a small fraction of a penny for every time that you listen to them. And they're not even getting that penny directly. So how these streaming services work is all of the money that Spotify makes goes into a big pot, and you don't get paid out per stream or per listener. You get paid out as a percentage of the total streams happening on the service. So what that means is musicians are sort of competing with each other. So if you have a big billionaire major label star taking up all of the streams in the industry, smaller working artists are simply getting nothing from it. And then that little you're getting from it is getting filtered through a record label. It's getting filtered through these royalty agencies. So you could talk about this stuff for hours, but the main point is artists are getting virtually nothing at the end of this line here. Yeah.
Now, can you talk about how the United Musicians and Allied Workers are using using their platform to discuss the issue with streaming and kind of doing what you're doing now, like trying to make it easier to understand? I think when I went on the website, I saw that like sometimes it's not even enough to buy a cup of coffee or breakfast. Like that's how little a lot of these artists are making. So can you just
Yeah.
talk a little bit more about the organization and what they're doing to address this?
Yeah, so UMAW or UMA started in 2020 with the intention of organizing music workers and musicians, anyone works in the industry, in a collective way, like a union, or in our case, kind of like a worker center model, to build power for musicians in this industry so we can take some of that money back that those tech CEOs and record labels are, we think, stealing from us. So, like in any industry, right, workers, we're only going to get paid what we're worth if we organize and collectively demand it. And it's hard for musicians to do, right? Because we kind of think of ourselves as very like individualistic, kind of our own little businesses. But it needs to be done because that's the only way we actually make inroads into this industry to get paid what we're worth. So in the case of streaming, musicians have been complaining about this for a long time, right? Just on Twitter, individually saying, "Oh, Spotify is terrible. We're not getting paid enough." But our position was we need to get a mass of workers together to change how this functions. So we launched a campaign in the fall of 2020 called Justice at Spotify. And we had some 30, 40,000 musicians signed on to an original demands letter demanding that royalties be transformed in these streaming services so that musicians directly are getting at least a penny per stream. That was kind of the fundamental demand here. And this made, news everywhere. We had in-person protests at Spotify offices all over the world, 10, 20, 15 offices, all on the same day. Out of this, we've worked with legislators, notably Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib's office, to create resolution, now working on legislation to change how royalties operate. So the big idea here is we don't have power as individual musicians, but like other workers, we can get together and transform how the industry works.
Now, I really want to highlight the fact that, as you mentioned, this isn't like a new thing. We've been seeing a lot of mainstream artists, which I think is crazy that even if mainstream artists are complaining or kind of voicing their concerns, then, I can only imagine what that is like for smaller and more independent artists. But that being said, what have musicians and just artists in general done to kind of make up for the lack of pay from streams?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You've seen people like Taylor Swift or Drake complaining about their royalty payments, and these people have enough money, but that even these superstars are feeling like in this tech dominated music industry they don't have enough power over their own music, right? That's wild. So you're absolutely right. You can think about how small a voice we have as working class artists or artists making music in non-pop genres, right? How hard it is as an individual to have a voice in this industry. As to what artists are doing to make up for the lack of streaming, there's not a lot of good answers. A lot of artists are simply leaving the industry. We've seen this happen, especially since COVID. A lot of artists simply can't afford to make music anymore. It's sad. You've seen the destruction of a lot of local arts communities because it's simply not sustainable. You see a lot of other artists having to tour, right, perform just constantly, like months and months out of the year to make ends meet. Ours, of course, don't have health care in this country because we don't have a single employer. So you see artists either dropping out of the industry or simply having to work so much harder than ever before to simply be able to continue to make music. Yeah.
There's also a focus on treating artists fairly because it's not just streaming, it's also, when they're at music festivals, which this is very new to me because this is not something that I've heard of before. Can you talk about the challenges with that? And I understand that there is a specific campaign that's targeting that. Can you talk a little bit more about that effort?
Yeah, so UMA works on a lot of issues. Streaming was one of the big campaigns, or continues to be one of the big campaigns. Also worked on things like, venues taking percentages of merch when we sell. We've worked on things like getting artists to, Palestine solidarity actions. And one of our other big campaigns was fair pay at South by Southwest. So that's a big music festival in Austin, Texas, that infamously pays artists next to nothing. Literally nothing in some cases. They offer artists either a badge to attend the festival or a $250 payment, which if you're traveling all the way to Austin, Texas from New York City, it's nothing, right? You're losing money inevitably. Meanwhile, this festival, if you go there, it's corporate everything. There's so much money flying around. They have the money to pay artists fairly. So same principle as the Justice Spotify campaign. We're like, we can't just complain about this as our own individual people on Twitter. We need to organize. So we got thousands of artists sign on to demands for demanding South by Southwest increase payments at this festival to artists. We went down to the festival. We had like our own protest concert. We had a picket outside of their offices. We still haven't met all our demands, right? We're going back this year, but just after 1 year of doing this campaign, already got artists, thousands of artists, $100 raise, some better treatment at the festival. And as far as I know, this is the first time at a major music festival like this, artists have organized and won something. So I think that campaign shows us when we do get together, when we do organize to fight, we can win. The job's not nearly done yet, but it can be done.
Now, as somebody who, I think everybody thoroughly enjoys music, I can't think of a single person who's not into music. Learning about some of this stuff was really shocking because when you think about how much time we spend, I think at the end of Spotify it tells you how many minutes you listen to at the end of the year, and you think about how the artists are being treated, it's very jarring. What can people who love music, who are a big fan of these artists do to actually further support these musicians?
It's a great question. Going to artist concerts is a big way to directly support, particularly artists in your community or local community where your, ticket money, you going to support them means a lot. Buying artist merchandise helps a lot. And supporting these kinds of campaigns, right? We need a mass of people who are invested, seeing musicians as people who deserve to be paid and treated fairly, just like people working in any industry. So when we have campaigns like Just Spotify or the Fair Pay at South by Southwest or the streaming legislation we're working on right now, we need everybody, musicians and fans, all supporting this to create a fairer arts economy if we want art to keep going, right? We need to have a fairer structure. It can't just all be subsumed by the tech CEOs.
Right, and I also want to add that you mentioned going to concerts, and I know that with that, there's been a little bit of a rift between fans and some of these really large musicians that kind of charge hundreds and hundreds of dollars. Can you quickly just let us know, if you know, is that a direct cause because of what's going on with streaming?
In some ways, there's a bunch of factors. I think a lot of the risks were coming from the big companies like Ticketmaster, where they're charging, in some cases, double the price that the artist wants to charge in secret fees at the end of the ticket. I think many fans are okay with paying some base rate to see the artist, but when they go see, there's another $50, $100, $150 that's just going to this giant corporation that has a monopoly. I think a lot of people are upset about that. And UNAW has also been involved in the effort to break up Ticketmaster's monopoly and kind of put a lid on this practice. But you're right, in most cases, not the artist choosing. Almost never is the artist choosing to do that. It's because Ticketmaster owns everything.
Right. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation. For everyone watching, to learn more about the work that United Musicians and Allied Workers is doing, and to help support them, please go to their website at www.weareumaw.org. We've come to the end of our show today. I'd like to thank all of our guests for joining us and you, the viewers, for tuning in. If you missed any part of today's show, you can catch the recable cast at 5 and 10 p.m. on Optimum Channel 67 and Verizon Fios Channel 33, or watch anytime on the web at bronxnet.org. You can catch a brand new episode of Open with Darren Hymie on Wednesday and with Rena Valentine on Friday. I'm Kibin Alleyne, wishing you and yours safety and wellness now and always. See you next time.